Hello and welcome to Press TV's News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tafai. Arrests in the thousands, reporters harassed and manhandled, protesters brought down with taser guns by the police, and the burning of the American flag. Scenes reminiscent of an Arab country caught up in a revolution or uprising. But such were the scenes this past week in the United States. Arrests to have passed the 6,000 mark, which in one day, 500 more were killed than arrested by police in Oakland. In this news analysis, we will discuss how the Occupy movement, which gained notoriety with Occupy Wall Street on September 17, 2011, cannot be ignored.
Occupy Miami's Peace City encampment got packed with lines of police in riot gear on Tuesday, when the deadline for protesters to leave their tents expired. The troops moved in, but the protesters tried to explain their cause to the officers and convince them that they are all in the same boat.
The right to health care, that's what we are fighting for. The right to equal wages, that's what we are fighting for.
We want to see something different. Don't you want to see something better in your community?
However, things gradually spiraled out of control, and police used violent tactics to drive the protesters out of their camp, making at least 3 arrests. In downtown Oakland over the weekend, California turned into a war zone as protesters tried to take over a vacant building. Police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowd and arrested over 500 people. Roughly 50 protesters have been arrested since September for taking part in anti-corporate protests on a daily average. Many say this has not only not suppressed the movement, but also helped it grow. Occupy protesters in Washington have defied a Monday night city deadline for them to leave their camp in McPherson Square. Hours before the deadline, police officers tasered a camp's resident in what the occupiers say was a clear warning for them to leave.
I have done nothing wrong!
The protesters in Washington say the tent camp belongs to all those people who've been made homeless by the economic crisis.
For a lot of people, this is the only place that they can go. There aren't shelters where they can go, or they don't have homes, warm places to live, and this has become such a huge family.
This notice is specifically intended to target the people that have no place else to sleep.
Some analysts say the 99%ers have fared well during winter's freezing temperatures, sending their message to people in most cities. As the weather improves, more actions and protests are likely to be planned by the occupiers to disrupt what they call capitalism's machine that has ruined their dream, a society that's fair and just.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Press TV News Analysis. From the International Action Center, Caleb Maupin joins us from New York. And we have co-author of Crashing the Tea Party, Paul Street, who joins us on the phone from Iowa City. Gentlemen, thank you both. Caleb Maupin, first to you. Last week, I'm sure you're aware, the 6,000 mark and arrest was passed, and then in one day, things took a turn for the worse. I'm referring to what happened in Oakland. More than 500 arrests made there. Hundreds more were injured. Why don't you do us a favor and make a comparative analysis to the arrests that were made, for example, during the Arab Spring or the Civil Rights Movement during the 60s?
Well, I would say that the arrests that are going on, as well as the arrests that happened in the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, are both arrests that are happening for a purpose. People are going out and they're putting themselves on the line, and they're saying, we're not going to allow things to continue to be the way they are, and we're going to risk arrest, we're going to risk being beaten and clubbed and maced by police because we're outraged and we're upset about the way things are, and we're not going to allow the way things are to continue. So many people have been left behind in this economic crisis that the only choice millions of youth have is to pour into the streets, to demonstrate in huge numbers, and to demand that things change. So I can see a definite parallel between that.
Well, Paul Street, let's talk a little bit about this occurrence in Oakland. The police tactics in particular has been described as an army of officers who marched on unarmed families, actually raised their guns. They fired bullets, tear gas canisters, smoke bombs, concussion grenades, and other explosive devices into the crowd. I mean, how do you explain that?
in all of this, Oakland has really been in the vanguard of brutality. They started the trend towards brutal smashing and blooding of people way back on October 25th, relatively early in Occupy's history, and it was they conducted back then what was described by one eyewitness as a Nazi-like stormtrooper raid in the dead of night. This is the one that finished with the cracking of the skull of Iraq War veteran Scott Olson, and they've continued in that mode ever since. I think Occupy had a brief sort of moment in the sun in the American corporate media, which if you had a certain amount of somewhat favorable coverage for a while and was tolerated briefly by Democratic Party city administrations, because it was perceived as something that might be consistent with the electoral agenda of the other great business party besides the Republicans, the Democrats. And they quickly realized that this was something that could not be contained within the traditional 1.5 party system, where both wings are completely subordinated to the 1% that owns more than a third of the wealth and more than 3/4 of the elected officials in the country. And the decision was clearly made, and it's very important to note that the repression has been conducted in cities run by Democratic Party mayors to institute a crackdown. And at the end of the day, when things get serious and people really step outside the two-party system and embrace a social movement politics and an anti-wealth politics and a populist politics, they do, in fact, have abundant resources of coercion, increasingly sophisticated modes and methods of repression that are employed in the streets of the United States of America no less than in the streets of Egypt or Russia or name your oppressive regime anywhere around the world. In fact, they have more sophisticated methods of suppressing dissenters than most other states in the world.
Well, like what do you mean? I mean, at this point, I just listed the tactics that were used in terms of the different methods of bullets, tear gas canisters, etc. I mean, what else is there? If you want to talk about imprisonment, well, we just talked about passing the 6,000 mark, one day 500. I mean, we just had a video that we had in our news bulletin on prison in Saudi Arabia, in which people were piled on top of each other. And this is reminiscent of from what we understand, occurred in the prisons in Oakland in terms of all the number of arrests that were made.
Oh, sure.
The same type of conditions. So, in a country such as the United States, I mean, the officials need to practice what they preach, shouldn't they?
Well, it's absolute sheer hypocrisy. It's one thing for an American to advocate more democracy in the Middle East or in a Latin American country or in China or elsewhere around the world. That's fine, but to demand more democracy and a government that's accountable to the people, to the many, to the purported beneficiaries of American government instead of the unelected dictatorship of money. To talk about problems of democracy at home is to set yourself up for beating and incarceration and for repression and harassment.
Caleb Maupin, let's talk about another thing.
It's sheer hypocrisy.
Let me bring in Caleb Maupin to talk about another thing, which is somewhat of a significant development, and it has gone viral, and it's the burning of the American flag by the Occupy Oakland protesters. I mean, we've seen the American flag upside down being shown repeatedly, but the burning of the flag, give us your assessment on that. I mean, in some respects, some are saying this is going to hurt the cause. What do you think?
Well, I think what people in the Occupy movement mean when they burn the U.S. flag is that they're saying that flag no longer and probably never did represent them. It represents the U.S. government, which is a tool of the corporations and of the bankers, and that they're rejecting it. And they're saying, we're burning this flag because it no longer represents what we stand for. And they're saying, rather, we need to create our own institutions and our own society, and we reject the society this flag stands for, which talks about freedom, and then when we pour out in the streets and try to use that freedom, clubs us, maces us, and attacks us. There's so much talk in the media right now, and that they're saying that the occupiers didn't have the right to be in Zuccotti Park. But I disagree. Because if you look at Zuccotti Park, every stone in Zuccotti Park was laid by mason workers. All of the iron handles were cast by iron workers. Sanitation workers cleaned that park. But Brookfield Properties, a corporation that owns Zuccotti Park, had nothing to do with it but the fact that they owned it. And that's a real example of how everything works in the United States. The 99%, the working class, creates everything, but a small group does nothing but owns it. And we're trying to overcome that. And as a movement, we're trying to get beyond the capitalist system where 1% owns and the rest creates and gets nothing but a small bit of wages in exchange.
Well, why don't you tell us, Paul Street talked about the elections coming up in terms of the Republicans and, of course, the Democrats. But what's going to happen when November comes and the U.S. president gets elected? I mean, from what we understand, the Occupy movement is not for Romney or the U.S. president. What would happen the day when President Barack Obama gets reelected? What is the Occupy movement going to do, given the fact that it's a leaderless movement, at least up to this point?
Well, I think the Occupy movement is going to continue no matter who's in office, because the understanding of the Occupy movement is that from the beginning, the founding fathers of the United States, that was the House of Burgesses, the original 1%, the plantation owners. Now it's the bankers and the corporations. It's always been the 1% that have run the U.S. And the only way to change and fight for the better is to build a strong pole of resistance and to build a movement from below to force the status quo to change and hopefully to maybe even remove this entire system based on profits and put the people in charge. So I don't think whoever gets into office or one candidate or other winning the election is going to make that much of a difference. All the candidates are united in their program of cutting social programs. They're united in attacking the people, and they're united in serving the 1% at the expense of the 99%. So I don't think that one candidate getting in or other is going to make a dime a difference.
Paul Street, incrementally, we have seen things getting worse in terms of arrests, police brutality. There were a few deaths. The burning of the American flag that I just mentioned there.
Right.
We had an incident where the smoke bomb was thrown into the White House. Bullets that have hit the White House window in an assassination attempt on Obama. I mean, the trend is alarming, isn't it? And some questions are arising. Where is this headed to? I mean, is there a chance that this is headed somewhat towards civil outbreaks, perhaps in certain states? I mean, we're seeing how in Oakland things get elevated to a higher level in terms of what has occurred, arrests, and, of course, the police tactics.
There's always a potential for violence when you have cities where most of the black communities in the country now have average unemployment rates that are like the Great Depression, that are like the 1930s. I mean, you have neighborhoods with 35, 40% unemployment rates. And there's this sense that the political system is completely unresponsive to people's needs. It's one of the things that drove Occupy. I mean, I think that it's a very powerful lesson to youth and increasingly the working class and minority people across the country that a Democratic administration got in the name of hope and change, and the basic underlying institutional realities of corporate rule, mass unemployment, bailouts for the few, imperial warfare, saber-rattling vis-a-vis Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran, and so forth. But all that continued on. There's a great lesson about the limits of the two-party system and the need for direct action beneath and beyond these quadrennial, corporate-crafted, candidate-centered electoral extravaganzas that they stage for us, every 4 years until that's the only politics that matters. So then when that feeling of powerlessness and no avenues of anywhere else to go hits the wall, there's always the potential for violence. Violence on the right, violence on the left. And it's something to be taken very seriously. And above all, there's the violence of the state, which is very underestimated by many people in the United States of America, and which, by the way, will be on display with a full regalia of militarized policing in Rahm Emanuel's Chicago this May, when we have the very important gatherings and a mass convergence of protesters around the G8 and the NATO meetings in that city. And we're really going to see the techniques and methods of modern-day state capitalist repression on display. And so violence is a very real fact of life, and America will continue to be so for some time.
Well, you talk about this meeting that's going to take place in which NATO is going to be present. How is the Occupy movement going to penetrate and deliver their message in that meeting? You talk about how suppression is going to be used. I mean, explain that a little bit further for us of what goals it would achieve by its presence.
Well, I'm quite sure that Occupy Chicago right now, a lot of its activities, along with other left groups in and around the city, a vast whole number of them, are talking about significant gatherings and protests and street protests and somewhat on the model of Seattle and earlier anti-globalization protests. One thing that's very interesting and useful about what's happening in Chicago is that the arrogant Rahm Emanuel, in his determination to sell the civic identity of Chicago as this great global city, has almost dared us. He's dared progressive forces. He's dared left forces to come out en masse. And we're going to, one of the interesting things about G8 and NATO at the same time is it combines both the issue of corporate globalization and corporate rule. That's G8. That's the economic meeting of the leading industrial powers in the world, and military imperialism. Sort of the great issue of the late 90s, which was global justice and global economic justice, and then the great issue after 9/11, which was fighting war, sort of combined together in one. As many Marxists have said, as I have said forever, these are the two sides of the same coin, military empire and economic inequality. We're getting both of them at the same time. With the authoritarian mayor of Chicago, who's the former chief of staff of the empire's new clothes, Barack Obama, in the city that is the campaign headquarters of Obama, that is itself an authoritarian one-party dictatorship. I think the potential there is very explosive. I hope we have a lot of media attention, including press TV, and that activists come from both coasts and from around the country, and indeed, since Chicago likes to call itself a global city now, from around the world, to really draw a line in the sand in Chicago, the site of the 1968 Democratic Convention, the site of the Haymarket marches in 1886, in May, I might add, and sort of the birth of the modern left labor movement in this country.
Let me introduce Eliane Schleiffer from the Occupy Columbus, joining us right now to get her reaction to some of the topics that we're talking about. Eliane Schleiffer, welcome to the program. Let me get your reaction on what happened in Oakland, which I'm sure you're aware.
Hi, pleasure to be
also
here.
Deemed to have been illegal what the police did in terms of the arrest, the kettling procedure, pretty much leading the protesters to a dead-end street, I believe, where the YMCA was, and then proceeded with the arrest. And, of course, any other opinions you have on how they handled the protesters who were out there protesting their right to free speech.
Well, obviously, I don't think anyone agrees with how Oakland handled it. I don't think there's ever a cause to use rubber bullets or tear gas on your own citizens, considering that they also live in your community just the same as the policeman and just the same as the mayor in her office. I think they need to be more respectful of the right to free speech and the right to free assembly. Now, I understand Mayor Kwan's frustration with the ongoing uprisings and what she feels is probably disruptive to city life. But I think that their Occupy movement is part of a broader national protest, and she needs to recognize that as well. I don't think there's ever cause to fire rubber bullets into a crowd of protesters. And I think we've all seen the images of the flag burning outside the YWCA or the YMCA. And I think that upset many watchers, and I think that sort of escalated the violence, especially when the police arrived on scene and saw that particular action. And one of the parts of Occupy that is hardest for people to understand is that we truly represent the 99%, and that does include all political persuasions, that does include all social persuasions, including anarchists. And I think that the ability of an occupier to say that they're going to take the action that they want to take is one of the strongest points of the movement, but it does result in that sort of action where maybe the entire group does not agree with what happened with the burning of the flag, and so that image is what's being blasted out about Occupy Oakland. But I think that overall, the message of the protest is not one of violence. It is not one of arson or lighting things on fire. That's just not what the movement is about. And I hate right now that what the press is focusing on is that single act of violence.
But it needs to be focused on, but it needs to be discussed. Maupin, let's talk again about this burning of the flag. In one sense, for the people who are doing okay, let's break it down. They have their jobs, they're supporting their family, perhaps deemed maybe something that is violent, but really, isn't that the frustration, deep-rooted frustration, looking at the stats on America when you have so many people on food stamps? I think it's estimated to be about 250 homes being foreclosed every day. broken families there. So that's where the burning of the flag perhaps emanates from, of people who are frustrated that are exposed to those circumstances.
Well, it is very sad that the media seems to have compassion for what damage being done to a piece of cloth, while there are millions, literally millions of people in prison in this country, which is supposedly free, at higher rates than any other country in the world. There's threats of war going on all around the world. People are under the constant state of violence. This is one of the most violent societies. Police brutality, which has been unleashed on the Occupy movement, goes on against people of color in the United States every day. And the fact that people are upset about a flag being burned, while this is the most violent and one of the most repressive societies, and on top of that, people are losing their homes. Like you said, food stamps, people are barely surviving. The fact that they're concerned about a flag being burned and they're not concerned about all of this is very, very tragic. Because a flag is a symbol, but there is a lot of reality, real suffering going on in this country, and many people are really suffering, and they're voicing their outrage. And if they choose to do it by symbolically lighting a flag on fire, that's their choice. And I think that's what the Occupy movement is referred to as diversity of tactics.
Eliane Schleiffer, I'd like to come to you for the final question. We're looking at obviously an election year. What's going to happen when November comes and Barack Obama gets reelected? Of course, you have on the other hand Mitt Romney who's contending that. But what is the Occupy movement going to do, given that it's a leaderless movement?
I think that's a question for the individual occupier. There's not going to be one united Occupy opinion. I think that if you walk down to any tent in any city, there are going to be people who do support Barack Obama and who do think he's made changes that are positive and progressive. And then you're going to find people who support Ron Paul. You may even find people who support Gingrich or Romney. And you'll find people who support the Green Movement or the Rainbow candidate. And so I think that no matter who winds up leading the country, Occupy itself is going to stand apart from that. Occupy is going to stand for the issues and for the changes that we want, rather than supporting or not supporting any specific candidate.
Well, I mean, you talk about that. That could also be looked as a weak point. That, as you mentioned, some may be for Ron Paul, some may be for another candidate, etc. Doesn't it need one focal point for this to be channeled to make the changes happen?
Yes, but that focal point is not the politician. The point of Occupy is that our nation right now is failing systemically, and supporting or not supporting any candidate for any office does not make systemic change. That's why we're working on all sorts of fronts about food stamps and Section 8 housing and student loan debt and credit card debt and banking and financial regulations. There are all sorts of facets to this movement, and whether or not the president who's in office actually changes doesn't really make a difference to that. We will still be applying the pressure to that office no matter who's in it.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Eliane Schleiffer there from Occupy Columbus. Also like to thank from the International Action Center, Caleb Maupin from New York, and organizer of the Occupy Columbus movement, co-author of Crashing the Tea Party, Paul Street, who gave us his statements on the phone from Iowa City. And thank you for watching another edition of the Press TV News Analysis. Any comments or suggestions, do send it to newsroom@presstv.ir. For me, Kaveh and the entire team, it's goodbye.